Hi, Helena.
Hi, Hannah.
So, thanks for agreeing to do this first recording for the Creative Research Methods EUTOPIA project. And we thought we'd kick off by talking about walking research methods and just have a conversation about the things that we have learnt through doing that method and the questions we have. So, I don't know if you could just quickly introduce yourself for those people watching or listening.
Yeah, my name is Helena Holgersson, and I'm a sociologist, but I work as a lecturer in cultural studies at the Department of Cultural Sciences at the University of Gothenburg. And I teach methods a lot, and I published some on methods too. And walking is, I think, my favorite method. I used it in a couple of studies, and also enjoy so much reading work that's based on walking methods. So, yeah, I think I'll get into some of the studies later, but that could be me.
Okay. I guess I should introduce myself as well. I'm Hannah Jones, and I work at the University of Warwick in the sociology department in the UK. And I've used walking methods in a few projects, but I've not used it as much as Helena. But I'm really interested in all the different ways that we can use different kinds of prompts and ways of collecting and thinking about knowledge production, which is how I got involved in this creative methods project. So I'm excited about talking about it, and hopefully it's going to be of interest to other people too.
And I forgot to mention that I do a lot of teaching on our master's program in culture and democracy. So I considered like walking methods part of kind of a critical urban studies methodology.
Yeah. Great. So we were going to talk first about what were we going to talk about first?
Different ways of walking, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. So what are walking methods?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, we talked about this before, and there's a few different ways that walking gets used in research, right? So one way of thinking about that is walking to reflect. So walking around and thinking about this as a way to thinking. So that's for lots of philosophers recommend walking, and poets.
Yeah.
And we can do it as social scientists or humanities scholars as well. The idea of the flaneur. But the flaneur also looks around and notices things. So we can also move on to thinking about walking to study the environment. So using space to look at the buildings or the people. And we might do that as researchers. I guess we're both interested in kind of the co-production of knowledge, aren't we? So I think the walking along, the go-alongs, and I think you're going to talk about that more in a minute, but the idea that you could take participants with you. So rather than going out as an individual researcher to look at the world and record it, take somebody with and go from seeing the world through their eyes, that kind of attitude, or talking about the spaces and the places and the ways of moving through the world together and make knowledge together that way. And we also talked about how walks can also be used to disseminate information. So that might be about teaching about the space, a city, potentially it's often in cities, and showing people the places and the histories. And we might do that as academic teachers, but also there's a kind of tradition of particularly city walks and telling people about the kind of historic, nostalgic areas as well.
And you did, you did your PhD at Goldsmiths, and they work a lot with the walks in teaching. So, and I think we are going to to offer kind of a list with texts and articles and writing on walks. So there'll be a few texts on like educational walks or.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the ways I got interested in walking methods was teaching on Caroline Knowles's module called London at Goldsmiths a few years ago, where it was about urban theory, but we took the students out to different parts of the city. So to look at the docks and think about what that meant for the history of trading, to go to the City of London and the financial district and think about the texts we were reading on financialization. So there's a whole kind of way of provoking thought as well as learning about the space through the walk.
Yeah, and in that kind of writing on walks, they often refer to the city as an archive somehow. And yeah, the next time people walk there, they will remember the things that Caroline or you talked about.
Yeah, we definitely we did think about that with Les Bach's walks as well, which I think will be on our reading list, about showing kind of the history of New Cross in South London and its music scene and its social history. And like you said, it's an archive already, but then once you've been on that walk, you will remember that was the building where this happened.
Yeah, because I think that's the way it is in everyday life, isn't it? That like when I pass like certain places, I remember specific people and even specific conversations that we had. And also I'm often like brought back to like specific periods of my life and how things was then, and also like with the people that I associate with that place. I think places are very associative that way.
And so that's also, so we were talking about producing that through walking tours, but also that's one of the reasons people like to take research participants on walks, is because it brings back those memories and associations in a way that is not always the usual story narrative you would tell from start to finish. And it produces its own kind of rhythm and narrative to an interview or encounter. Yeah. So it's not necessarily just about walking and putting one foot in front of the other. And of course, it shows us also how hard moving around a city in particular might be in terms of walking, but it's also about being in space a lot of the time, the walking method. Shall we talk a bit about some examples of work that we've done?
We could start there. I think, well, for me, like it started with my my PhD thesis, and I just thought that I'll show it like this because the image on the cover, it's from a walk. It's taken from the vantage point at a hill in Gothenburg, where one of my interviewees took me, and the title of my thesis is the urban geography of non-citizenship. So what I was looking at was how, for one thing, how the municipality of Gothenburg kind of dealt with and related to the fact that a lot of people live in the city under the threat of deportation. It's in the Swedish context, at least at that time, it was mostly rejected asylum seekers. But I wanted to know, like, what I found was that it was more difficult at the local level to be very strict, like policy-wise, because I mean, kids needs to go to school, people get sick. There's like dysfunctional families where you need to take care of the kids and so on. So the policies on a local level was more generous. So I found that interesting. But I also wanted to know how why people in this situation chose to come to Gothenburg and how they organized their life, and also what how they navigated in the urban landscape, like, and how and why. It's 15 years ago, so much happened since then. It's kind of a very dated study now, I think, when it comes to issues of migrations. The discourse has completely changed, but at this time, I mean, now this group would be they would be referred to as illegal immigrants in mainstream media, and that wasn't at all the case then. They were referred to as hidden refugees, and that it was and were also often described as living in hiding and underground and outside of society. And when I started to interview people, I realized that they were not at all in hiding, like in any literal sense. They were working, they had social lives, they also had a great need to get out of their very crowded apartments where they lived. So I needed to find kind of methods that would help me explore those issues. So I used maps. I asked them to draw maps of Gothenburg. We won't talk so much about that today. But I also asked them to bring me to places that meant something for them, to take a walk. And I did that after we had a more formal interview, a more like traditional semi-structured interview. So it was like a complement to that. And this was one of the walks that this man took me to this hill. And for him, it was really his map. It included like the whole city. He had been living in a lot of places. He had friends all over. I mean, he had been here for 5 years at that time, and also he expressed a great need to like for to not to go insane. He needed to go to green areas of different kinds. This was one of the places that he returned to. And the picture, it's not taken during the walk. I brought a photographer there to take some pictures because it's also how I start the first page of the PhD is kind of it's not from my notebook, but it's a description of that walk, and that's so it really got like
you talked a lot about
the field work somehow for me. This particular walk.
Because you've also written as well, haven't you, about how walks give a story to research as well, and they can help to frame the participants' narratives as well.
Yeah. So I thought, it was a very good way to introduce the topic for the reader, to start there at that hill as we were like looking out, and he was pointing at places where he used to live and telling me about why he so often came there. So that was my first set of walks, and I found that it was it worked so well. Like it was such a nice thing to like. It was really important for me in this particular case with this particular study not to recreate like the interrogation at the migration board. So in the more formal interviews, I was also. It was really important where the interview took place. So I was often in people's homes or at some voluntary organization that they trusted, or even outside sometimes. But something happened when they took me to these walks. It was much more of a conversation, and maybe it also was because it was the second time they met me. I don't know. But I think it was something about the walk, and that's something that I experienced with other sets of walks too, that it's not just me asking questions, that people ask the researchers a lot of questions when you walk. So it's much more of a conversation. And it's also a way to kind of talk about ethics and talk about, they ask you a lot about like, but this study, like when will you be finished, and how will this be a book, and you can talk about these issues as you walk.
Because it's outside of the formal interview question and answer.
So I think in my experience, people ask much more these kind of issues, and where do you live and why, and where did you grow up, and I think it's like opening up for such a relation. So I'm not saying that like the power relation is equalized. I mean, of course it's not, but something happens because this is a place that they know better than you often, and they show you around, and it's often like I think it's a nice thing to walk with someone. It's like So I really felt when I had a new research project after the PhD that I wanted to keep working with this method, and this time I felt like maybe it's not necessary to do formal interviews first. let's just do the interviews on foot and record them as you go. I didn't record the first set of interviews. I just made notes afterwards because I already had the interviews then. So the new project, it was a study on the gentrification of an old rundown industrial area in Gothenburg. And at the time when I made these walks, it had been partly demolished already, but parts of the building, some of the buildings were still there, and they were still negotiating with to buy them out. So some people were still in the area, and some people had already been displaced. And the people in the area, it wasn't people living there; it was organizations and small companies of different kinds. But it was just 10 years before this that we had there had been a study that saw there was kind of maybe 50 different stores and organizations in the area, and then you have all these their customers and all their members. So it was like an area that was very much in use. But we interviewed both people from these organizations and the companies, and then both people who had already been displaced and people who were at risk of being displaced. And we also interviewed the municipal developers or employees at the municipal developer and employees at the private builders. That was part of the project.
And those developer interviews are the really kind of key one, aren't they?
Yeah, I think so. For me, yes, that was the ones that I used most in my writing after in this project, because we were working with a photographer in the project too. So she also did a photo book where she interviewed a lot of the people in the area, the about to be displaced people. So the people from the builders and developers were kind of mine to write about. But I did walks with the people in the area too. But I think with the interesting thing with the developers and the builders, or the people from them, it was how they were quite unfamiliar with the area, and it was quite a surprise to me, but also interesting in the conversation that they really they worked all day long with the future of this area, with the models and maps, and also with buying, like negotiating to buy all this land and so on. But when they got there, they couldn't really find their way. They didn't know exactly where their sites were, and they were quite uncomfortable. And to me, it was really a way to kind of force them to talk about the social consequences of the project, and to talk about the people that was because there were still buildings there that I could point at, and I knew who was in that building, and we could talk about that. And it was difficult for them to just change the topic when we were in the area. So I think I wrote an article or a chapter in a book on that. The walking methods are often used with vulnerable groups, or either vulnerable people or ordinary people, to look at how they experience their everyday environments. But I really think that it's in urban research we need to bring to walk with the powerful people too, or the elite, and I mean, if they agree to do that, which people did in my case, which was fantastic. So that's I think there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, and that made me think about physicality in both the projects. You talked about there's lots of ways that walking methods are about the physical presence, but in the first project, the that some of the disruptions in the interview process and the ability to kind of break some of those invisible walls around asking you questions and challenging you as the researcher were partly about the physical presence in a different environment that someone's leading you in, and the walking together, being side by side and not necessarily having to make or break eye contact. And so different kinds of body languages and physical cues that we learn differently. But then in the completely different version of the physical in the walks with the elite and the planners, because you were making by going to the place, they were having to make it a real physical place rather than the documents and the measurements.
Yeah. One of them actually checked in on Facebook as we arrived. And that was really interesting because you could definitely not check into the old area. So she kind of checked into the area that wasn't even there yet. We could. I think we're going to get into kind of time later, and with the kind of ghosts and pasts and futures, like about that.
And we were going to talk as well about your kind of revisiting of that research with students and how that different kind of walking method worked.
Yeah, but maybe you should. We could talk about your work too. Because there was like two walking projects.
Yeah, so I'm certainly not as much of an expert on walking methods as you are in terms of practice, but I've used it alongside other methods, and recognize a lot of the things that you're talking about. So as a prompt, as a way of remembering and changing the narrative, I used it when I was a researcher on a project led by Sarah Neal, who's at the University of Sheffield, on called Living Multiculture. And there was various parts to that. It was a project about understanding everyday lived diversity, ethnic diversity, and mainly ethnic diversity in different parts of England. And so there were different sites. There were kind of community groups, there were schools, and there were parks. So particularly we used walking in looking at the public parks. And that was a really effective way of knowing the space through other people's eyes, because we also did ethnography there, and you could sit and watch the different uses of the park. And we did focus groups which drew on the interviews, but the interviews really brought out the life histories and the attachments to that place, which you wouldn't see from observing people using the playground or having a picnic. And it was really striking that there were certain parts of a particular park that had the same kind of attachments for very different people. So like you said, once someone's told you a story on a walk, you remember it whenever you walk past that thing. And it was a park in Hackney where I lived nearby at the time. And there was a slope, just some trees, and there was nothing to it, not something you would think of if you were just passing by. But two women, one in their 70s, I think, and one in her 50s, had memories of using it either with their children or as children to sledge, to go down in the snow and play on in the snow. And a really great place to do that. And they stopped at this unremarkable slope and told me very similar stories of a woman who was originally from Ireland and who was in her 70s, and a woman who was in her 50s, I think, and grew up in Hackney and was African Caribbean. And so it's not surprising they will both be sledging, but it's surprising that anyone would have those such similar memories of a place where I don't think they were sledging there together. The same with a particular tree or a particular patch of the park that people would say, that's where this happened to me, or that's where I'd go with my grandson. And so it really showed the use of that kind of space, which is an unmarked, unformed space in some ways, an open park. Obviously, there are things like benches and so on. But
it reminded me of the walk with the man on this hill that I talked about, that it wasn't only this particular hill. This hill reminded him of hills where he grew up. Like a kind of environment that brings something out of memory. So it's a kind of place, or
those place memories. It's not that you can't get to them without walking. Like there are ways to talk to people and learn about those attachments, but they're not things that are necessarily part of a often told story or something someone would think a researcher was interested in. Whereas you can be taken to really unexpected places and not just hear about that place it reminds him of, but why that mattered and how it mattered to his life now.
Yeah. No, because the people in the PhD study, they had very difficult knowing what I was interested in. Like they thought that this with places was a bit like, why do you want to know this? What is this interesting for? And I had to like explain why I thought that was interesting. So then they told me things. But as you said, that I think some of them had been interviewed before. It's also when you do research with groups like this, it's quite common that you find interviewees through organizations, and they have kind of spokespersons. So some of them had a quite like, this is how I talk to journalists or researchers about my experience of being an asylum seeker or having my application being rejected. And then they were quite like surprised by my focus on place and favorite places and things like that. So it was, and that they didn't have so many like already prepared stories. It made me more convinced that this was something I wanted to keep exploring.
Yeah, I think that kind of exploration of the everyday. I mean, we've talked mostly about urban life, but also it's about everyday life. Usually walking is about seeing the things that are unremarkable, might connect to much more remarkable things, which when one's being a research participant don't feel like worth telling. You know, this important researchers come to ask me questions, or they always want to know these particular facts. So walks can be a great way of disrupting that as well, the kind of narrative. And then the other place where I used walks is on a more recent project with Alice Araya at Lancaster and Melissa Ono George, which was a British Academy small project which we're hoping to expand. But that was really interested in student anti-racist activists, so how students who were students of colour in the universities in the UK deal with racism in the university. So their activism rather than their experience of being racialized or discriminated against, which obviously is related but wasn't the story. And the same thing happened. That was a multi-method project where we had a workshop with the participants and over 2 days, and we used different methods, including participatory methods, and they helped us to shape how we might research this further before we did the walks. But one of the things that came up in that workshop was they started to feel that they were being asked to recount their experiences of racism and very difficult and painful experiences, as well as ones that they felt had been, it was a re-victimizing. And that obviously, that wasn't our intention. In fact, it was more about trying to say, that's obviously there, but what's the experience of activism and how can that be developed and connected to challenge racism? So again, it was this kind of expectation of a particular story that was being asked for. And the walks came later, so they might have been more useful earlier, but in some ways they were about, we then interviewed them individually in the places where they studied. So they could take us anywhere around the campus. Some of them were not campus universities, so it would include the cafe nearby, or the street, and not to show us the place they studied or the place they had a protest or the place, but it could include that. And it was really a way of, again, breaking this expectation of sit down and tell me, but also to understand the recognition and the different kind of things one encounters in that place. So we could also, it was also about showing us what it was like at this particular university by the seaside, or this one in the middle of London, or this one in the countryside somewhere, and how the different student bodies and buildings helped make up that experience.
So you think the walks added to the fieldwork?
I think they did, but they were less about the geography and the kind of telling us those things I just described, like what the buildings looked like. But they gave the opportunity for the participants to bring that in if they wanted to. And it also reminded them of certain things. So we were walking along. I remember walking along, kind of the person going, I don't know where to take you, but we had the experience of walking and that evoking different conversation, and then seeing a building and saying, oh, that's where this meeting happened that was really outrageous, and these things were said, which they might not have had on their list of things to tell. And those were narrative interviews as well. So they were also there were no questions. The question was, tell me your story about your experience of anti-racist activism. You can start and finish where you like, which is also can be quite intimidating for an interviewee. Even if you've been told, you've kind of, do you want me to keep talking? So that the walk gave some more prompts as well if people ran out of steam. So in some ways it was giving different scripts and different prompts, which is, I think, often a factor in creative methods, trying to produce different narratives or new ways of looking at a problem, often by bouncing off a prompt which might be visual or spatial or something else. So I think they were useful, but I hadn't thought of it as a walking project until we talked about doing this discussion. I mean, the other thing that people use a lot in walking is photography. You've got some thoughts on sociologists in particular trying to be photographers.
I know. I remember like talking about that with the photographer that we collaborated with in the project on the industrial area. Katarina Despotovic is her name. Now she was looking at a lot of visual sociology, and she was like, she wasn't that impressed. She felt that like they were inspired, but that they were not trained photographers. So we talked. That it made me think, because I've been in other collaborative projects as well, and I'm really like interested in art-based research, but I'm also like I feel like I have a lot of respect for their craft, for the craft of the artist. It's not like I think I mean it depends on who you are and what you can have a double experience, and you could be trained, but I'm not a trained artist or a photographer. I can do that kind of to illustrate things or show. I took photographies in the industrial area too, but more to maybe very descriptive to show what it looks like, or specific buildings and so on. But I mean, her photographic documentation of the area and the people, that's something else. I could never do that. So I have such respect for her craft like that. But with that said, that doesn't mean that you can't use photography or like other like artistic methods to explore things. It doesn't mean that you have to publish a photo book on it. Like it could be a way to, as you said, make people talk like about things that didn't come up in the interview, or to just try different ways of like continuing a conversation. Or
I mean, I find it useful doing which I haven't really done so much for research, but actually when doing ethnography as well, that's of space in that ethnography in parks, to take photographs. Now it's so easy, to do it on your telephone, to take pictures on your mobile phone as note taking. So in some ways easier than trying to write down what you saw, and also you might see something else in it, and it's a kind of visual ethnography, but it's also just a note taking of the experience of the walk, to remember not just what you saw, but maybe something that happened on the walk at that time. Someone ran into the traffic and you take the picture afterwards, or there was a smell. That it can be an interesting complement to the walking.
Sometimes I think a way to study an environment that you're familiar with, like to kind of take like to have a new to look at it in a new way, like with a new focus somehow.
I remember when I came to visit you in Gothenburg once, and I started to notice there were so many hairdressers, and I started taking pictures of all the hairdressers and barbers. But once you see something like that, it's a really silly example, but I did a walk around here when we were doing this online workshop recently through Goldsmiths, and suddenly saw that where I live as well, there are loads of hairdressers and barber shops. But those kind of, I mean, it's like I say, a silly example, but once you start to pick up on something, that can start to open up new avenues of thinking about how space is used and different ways different people use it.
I was teaching an undergraduate class where the examination was to write a small text, like on you were supposed to go to a place, have a walk, take some pictures, and then you were supposed to write about that using theories of gentrification. It was like a very kind of obvious example of a gentrifying area. But with when I read or marked these essays, it really, I think that taking the pictures helped them find a focus. Someone focused on the ground, or on, as you said, as hairdressers, or someone on posters, and someone on construction work, and someone on kind of like street art, and then they had something to.
Yeah, which is basically like a research project. You can't study asylum seekers as one is not a topic, but something about the way that particular asylum seekers use space and experience the city is a topic, or a street.
I'm not against photography.
No, I didn't mean to say that. It was a provocative thing. Also, because I remembered that one time I had used walking methods during my PhD was for mapping out the space of the local authority I was studying by following the local authority government boundaries and taking photographs and publishing them, and feeling like I'm not really a photographer. But it was a similar thing of making note of something which provokes ideas, I guess. And I guess that is what our next kind of area we thought we'd talk about, was the idea of what walking methods can prompt us to think about. So as well as having a prompt to think about on a walk, like the ground or the posters. What would you like to pick from all the many things walking prompts us to explore?
I don't know. I think the one theme that I like that became so obvious when I worked with people in this like partly demolished industrial area was that both in people's minds, like both the future and the present was both the future and the past was so present. So when I worked with people who were tenants there, or like a part of organizations or companies, they would point at buildings that were not there anymore and tell me about them as if they were still there. Like when they passed them, they still passed the old like paint factory where I'm thinking about one man now that used to work in that particular factory when he came to Sweden in the 60s from Finland. And as I said, like, he really pointed at it. It was still kind of there for him. And then with the people from the developer, they were of course pointing at buildings that were in their models or maps that they were planning to build, but hadn't been started to be built yet. So I was really struck by that, like how both the past and the present was there. And then when I wrote about that, it was also it was obvious that there was a negotiation, like about the like in a gentrification process, like how to remember the past and what the future will be like, and we were walking like in such a like just in the middle of that negotiation somehow. So I guess that also connects with like time a lot.
Yeah. I was thinking it makes us think about, we think walking is obviously about place and space because it's about moving through spaces and thinking about them as places, but those kind of observations, it's about time, because if people talk about the place they're in the past and the future, but also the time spent on the duration of the walk, you could think about. But also that a geographer might well say, what places are made up of time as well as space. So there's the way we experience the city is through our memories and expectations, as well as just the moment of that street. So maybe it just brings that more into focus than we might think. I guess it also, those kind of, the presence of being on a walk brings up different method questions as well. About, we talked about recording, making notes on a phone, but how to record, and not just the practicality of the wind and the rain.
I had one of my most memorable walks was with the two managers at the municipal developer, and it had snowed that night, so it was this much snow in the area, and we were just like trying to make our way through the area, slipping, kind of laughing about that. And it was just like a very different setting than if I would have been in their conference room making the interview.
But that's nice. So it wasn't so much that the weather was, it made it difficult to walk, but it made maybe the encounter more productive, because it was shared experience.
Yeah. I guess, it could have been that you yourself or the person that you walk with, like, just wanted to get it over and done with, but that wasn't my experience in that case. But I guess that could also happen, that people would just want to get inside and But there was some parts of the recordings that it's a little bit hard to hear, but generally I think it worked. It worked really well, actually.
So it's just about checking the sound and trying to work out how your recorder works, I guess, and those kind of practical things.
Yeah, and I wasn't going to broadcast it, the recording. Yeah. If there's one spot that isn't like you can hear like word by word, you can still hear what we're talking about. So I think it's still worth it.
And what about other practical things, like people who have mobility impairments? Have you ever done a walking interview with someone who can't walk?
No, I think there was some seniors in Quillebäck, and that we took a quite short walk, and then we kind of went back to the venue of their organization and continued the interview there. But I think, and that was actually the man who pointed out the paint factory. So it was still worth it to just get outside, and even if it wasn't a long walk, it's still, as you said, prompted some. Like he was reminded of things, and he really showed me a lot of things. I think it was a great way for me to get a sense of what the everyday life in the area used to be, because, as I said, it was a bit. At the time, since it was half demolished, it was quite hard to understand, like,
what was
it like. Yeah. And you told me, or you brought that up before, that we brought students there, because this is, I think, at that time it was a really difficult area just to go there and have a walk and understand why this would be worth saving, or why this would be like valuable in any sense, because it was just a mess. I mean, you had the demolished sites, and you also had the buildings who was in really bad shape. And also, and even before they demolished some of the buildings they didn't look much because they hadn't been renovated, like externally renovated for a long time, because there was this like in between. No one knew what would happen to this area, so no one would invest. But the thing was with Katarina Despotovic, our photographer, who did her ethnography there. She was able to kind of she was there for a couple of years, and she really knocked on all the doors and was able to kind of enter the buildings, and then you could see how much effort and like time people have spent to kind of renovate the venues inside, and how many different like activities that was going on there, and during that time we were able to bring like colleagues, researcher colleagues, to the area, and also just walking there, but also get inside the buildings and meet these people. I mean, of course, this isn't something that you could do every week. They didn't have that time to spend with us, but at some occasions we were able to do that. Mm-hmm. And some of the people in the area, they moved just to the industrial area. They actually just redeveloped half of the industrial area. So some of the people, they now have venues in the other half of the area that is kind of in the same situation now, that it might be redeveloped like in the coming years. So they have short-term contracts there instead. But now we can bring students in that the area, the part of the area that is left, and also to be able to enter some of the buildings, and that makes such a big difference that you could kind of. I think
so some of it's about not so much walking as visiting or experiencing or being in the not just seeing, but being in the place.
I think as a flaneur, that wouldn't be enough in this area. I don't know, if you're not from there, if you don't have any experience, if you're not talking to anyone that has, I think you would kind of agree with the developer that there's nothing there, or it's just a mess, or it's ugly, or it's run down, or but it has potential. Maybe we could do something cool here. Yeah. You would easily get into those thoughts if you didn't have then
the longer relationship with the place.
Yeah. So,
I think, I just wanted to go back to the thing about walking is also not just walking methods are not just about walking. They're also, so a lot of the interviews I've done walking will often end up in a cafe or somewhere, or sit down for a rest. So they're also about being together in a place and being able to move around and being directed to some extent by the participant usually. And that might be a way of thinking also about if there are mobility problems, that it doesn't mean you can't do this kind of method with people who might need walking aids or whatever, that you can do things at a different pace or at different locations and led by the participant. But there are also other kinds of limits on different people's experience of space. So whether that's about permission to enter certain spaces, whether it's about feelings of risk around gender or race, migration status, that they need to be thought through. It doesn't mean that there's a reason not to do this kind of research, but that's a shared question.
In the first project, I didn't do walks with all the interviewees. I can't really recall if someone said no, but I think if I remember it right, that I didn't even ask some of the people, because I thought that because the people that I did walk with, they were quite. You could see in their maps that they really moved through the city and and used public space. But there were also some people who were really scared to go out at all, and to ask someone like that to have a walk. That would be that productive or ethical. And also, I guess there is that is there a risk for the person to be seen with the researcher? Or I mean, those things needs to be considered, I guess. And I guess also that maybe some topics aren't like suitable to talk about in public, like for maybe not for someone to hear it, but maybe people are uncomfortable like discussing certain issues. So maybe sometimes maybe walks need to be complemented with a more like proper like traditional sit down interview in a classroom.
Yeah, I guess we've talked about how often walking methods are part of another set of methods or are linked to they're not divorced from ethnography or interviewing or other kinds of sensory or visual methods. So but there is particular things that we might think about in terms of the moving through space together and what that brings out. I guess we also thought about how we've been talking mainly about urban research and often research about use of space. And you had this nice question about what would happen. Are walking methods used? I mean, of course, they could be used in any kind of rural space as well. But what about if they were used for different topics that aren't to do with the space and that potential?
Yeah, but I think like that's with this that we both experienced that something happened with the relation between the researcher and the participant. I mean that would happen, I guess, if you talked about something completely different too. So I guess I didn't see so much writing on like such. I think most people that do walking interviews talk about space, but I mean, I think there's potential for interviews on other topics too.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose thinking about the student activists, we weren't so much interested in the geographical questions, but they came into informing the kind of life experiences and the encounters with the institution. But I think also the walking, as I said, was a way of doing a narrative interview that didn't feel terrifying or unprompted and had these additional things. So I think you're right, though. I don't think there's been that much written on that aspect.
And also, if you just if you make the walk in an environment or at a place that is like at least somehow connected to the topic, is this where you lived during the period that we're talking about? Is this where you went to school, if that's what the topic is? As I think, because you talk a lot about that people like come to think about things as you see something. I guess that would of course happen if you talk about something else as well.
Yeah. So do you think we should probably wrap up now, but do you think we should set a task for listeners to try out the walking method?
Yeah, I was thinking about with the walking methods. I guess I think it's like a bit to ask students to find someone who's at risk of deportation or displacement might be difficult.
I think that's a good idea.
It's part of that, yeah. So, but I think maybe I think it's interesting if you're interested with this time aspect that I focused a lot on. I think you could ask someone, maybe a friend, but maybe even better if it's someone, a friend of a friend, maybe not someone you know too well, but to ask to take you to a place where they used to live or where they used to go to school or used to work, and just have a walk and talk about that time in their life, maybe, and just see how that works. If they think about how they associate or and maybe just to try out if it makes a difference to be in this place when you talk about this, or if it doesn't.
Yeah. So to do it and then to try and reflect on how much the place seemed to inform the conversation.
Yeah. And of course, like if it felt comfortable, if you could kind of relate that to what we talk about with walking as a common activity, if you compare to a more traditional interview, and like just have a think about that.
Great. And I'll suggest something around doing a kind of solitary walk in case you don't have a friend of a friend who wants to go on a walk. And maybe think as a complementary activity to take a walk around maybe a familiar path, like a walk that you do on a daily basis, or to the supermarket or to the park yourself, and to try and do that noticing what's going on. So to think like an ethnographer and to see what sorts of things you notice while trying to pay attention rather than go about daily life.
Maybe take some pictures as notes.
Yeah, and see how taking pictures as notes works and whether they make sense afterwards or not. It's always a problem with field notes. Okay, well, thanks a lot, Helena.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, bye then.